All right, we good? All right, we're good. Cheers.
Hey.
Salud.
Cheers. Again.
Yeah. I know, but we got to do it for the camera.
Right on.
We'll, so, Corey and Scott. Corey, this is Scott. Scott, this is Corey.
Corey.
So you guys,
Scott.
so you guys just met.
Just met.
But both of you are sort of like friends of mine.
Sure, we'll take that.
We've been
Sound like a stretch.
So both of you guys are people that I met like in the business world, and so we're sort of like, you know, like we're not like go to the beach together on Saturday friends, hang like family vacations together or anything like that. But we're you know, but we do get together and drink occasionally.
I classify you as a friend of mine.
Do you? Do I count as a friend?
Yeah.
But the go to the beach
treat
part,
you
that's a
as a-
good
Not-
clarification.
Not the go to
Yeah,
the
not go to the beach.
So, and Corey, you've been on this show before,
Yep.
and it was a popular episode, by the way. Apparently, you said good stuff. And
Shocking.
and Scott, you haven't been on this one, but you were 2 or 3 times on the oil and gas tech show,
show,
right? Which is no longer the tech show, which has now been
I actually missed it.
rebooted. Well,
Did it come
it's back in a new form, so it's now Oilfield Ingenuity, and
I'll have to check it out.
and I got rid of those pesky guests that I always had to try
They kept having the same conversation over.
every single time. So, all right. So here's the thing. Before we get into the thing for today, Trevor suggested that we lead off with banana shit. So let's. Trev, can you pull up? This was a. Can you make it bigger? This was a review that we got on Apple Podcasts a while back from Banana Shit, and please, what dream are you please stop. What dream are you saving? You're a cis white man. What have you ever had to overcome? Now, there's a whole story about how I got to where I am, and there was some things to overcome along the way. But and what was it we wrote? What's at the top of the page? Yeah, so we always welcome, you know, we always welcome people's input, open, honest conversation. But our advice was that Banana should learn to spell banana correctly if he or she wants people to take him seriously. So Trev, what was the point? Why did we want to start with this? Unmute.
There's just because there's 3 y'all now, so I thought we'd just
Yeah, three
Established
white
as
cis, yeah,
establish.
Oh, 3 white.
cisgender.
Cis-
Yeah,
So when you got, all right, so let's because we're going to talk about parenting, but we all got to be parents and all 3 of us are of a certain age.
we're in the neighborhood.
Oh,
for sure.
of a certain. What was that? Trevor? What was that Frasier episode where he said, "I am not of a certain age, like I'm halfway between not a kid anymore and old enough to know better." But but we all have kids that are grown out of the house, grown up, and I frequently think about how when I look at things that are going on now in the world, and it's not in the world so much, but in society, and I think, I'm glad I'm not trying to raise kids right now because it's more complicated. But I want to get to that. But we all got to, like, we got to a life where we were able to raise kids. All our kids are like off and doing their thing, and we all live nice, cushy, comfortable lives. When you see somebody that says that, you're a white, what is it? White
White cisgender.
cisgender.
Basically, it means that you're heterosexual.
Okay.
And you're a man, and you think you're a man.
And that you prefer.
It's what we used to call normal.
Okay.
Kind of. I mean, Corey disagrees.
Well, I mean, that's what we called normal.
It's what we used to call. It's what we used to say. Yeah.
But we had put a definition on normal, right?
Yeah.
And we kind of put some boundaries around that, perhaps unknowing that or being in a very biased position.
Yeah, perhaps.
Yeah.
So now when you see somebody who, and you guys have both listened to this show before, so you kind of know what it's about and the approach that we take. What do you think? So I'm just curious, what's your response when you see that? Because I mean, you know, everybody's got their opinion. It's a criticism. It's obviously this person. This is what they got in their head.
Well, my initial thought, actually, there are two things. There are two questions there, right? And I'll take the second one as the first question. I'm a cis white man, and what have I ever had to overcome? And look, I'm not saying that, excuse me, that I am not without my privileges, and I don't disagree with that whatsoever. Just being able to walk on 2 feet and be relatively healthy is a privilege.
Sure.
And so I'll take that over the alternative any day. But every single person has had to overcome some hardship in their life.
Right.
And so I'll start off with an easy hardship that I had to overcome was having teenage parents who had me out of wedlock, and I was sitting in the audience when my father walked across the stage at high school graduation, and my mother didn't get her GED until much later. So that's a challenge to overcome, both for them and then later on, of course, for myself.
Yeah.
But the other question, what dream are we saving? I think we're saving the dream that allows people that are not white cisgender men to enjoy, to have the joy in life that they would like to have, that without having to worry about being privileged in some way.
Yeah. Right. I follow you. It was the whole idea of, you know, I don't have the book here because
I'm surprised because you always have the book.
I took it to Studio B for the 4th of July episode. So, but that whole concept of it's a place where everybody has some opportunity to do better than they might have done otherwise. A lot of people feel like that's not what we have right now, and that's not what we ever had. But that's the idea, right?
Hence that response.
So, Scott? What do you think?
Well, I actually almost absolutely concur with that. My upbringing was actually a little bit different. I came from a very privileged background, very well-educated parents, private school, and in some respects, there weren't a whole lot of things I had to overcome. I mean, there's some personal trials, you know, throughout everything, like anyone else. But there's no question I came from a privileged background. Now, I wouldn't say we were rich. I wouldn't say that we were upper class. But we didn't want for anything. We didn't want for education. We didn't want for food. We didn't, you know, whatever was needed was provided. You know, for me, I look at that comment and I don't necessarily shrug it off. I acknowledge that I'm privileged. But I also took advantage of all those privileges that were given to me. Because once I started, and certainly I went to the university and got an advanced degree, all of which are privileged positions. But then it was up to me to make a life for myself. Things weren't handed to me. It wasn't as if, you know, someone gave me, you know, I had no money when I got started. I didn't have any debt, but I had no money. And you just went to work, and I worked. And not that other people didn't have much higher hills to overcome than I did. They absolutely did. But I'm not going to apologize that my parents provided everything I needed to get off to a running start. Yeah. And away you go.
I think the question is, and I have my own story about starting off with no money and a baby, and not too dissimilar from your parents.
Yeah.
But the question is, so the assumption when somebody says that is, so automatically, because you are a cis white man, automatically you're not qualified to speak on anything or carry a particular cause or host a show about life in America or anything, right? Like, or whatever other things. Like automatically because you're either privileged or not or whatever. Like even Scott, in your situation, it doesn't mean that you're unqualified to have an opinion on things or to talk. I mean, you've spent 65, 75 years living in.
Absolutely. I mean, I think to your point, to the point of what we're doing, it's a conversation, and it's a conversation for everyone and anyone. And I don't think anyone in my status, and again, I don't know that I'm certainly not in the upper crust of incomes but I'm not hurting for anything.
I missed you at the last World Economic Forum.
Yes.
Meeting.
But I do like, there is an underlying judgment to that second question, right?
Yeah.
But I like the challenge of the first question, right? So perhaps we need to be answering that question every single day. What dream are we actually trying to save?
I knew I could count on you to.
You're welcome.
See some sort of goodness even in the most annoying things. You do have that sort of open. Trev, were you chiming in with something there? I saw you.
Yeah. So, just from my perspective, because this is something I come across a lot, my age and the people I'm around. The perspective that I've found is when you dissect what this sort of conversation entails. It's twofold. The first part is, one, you're implying that there is if we're all privileged to some degree, then there's a line at which you have a certain amount of privilege that discredits your experiences and lessens your opinions on various matters. And then the second part to that it leads to is, once somebody has crossed that line, what do we do with them? Are we supposed to just level out the privilege across everybody? What is too much privilege? Why should they not be allowed to have that privilege? Or then what do you do with the people that you redistribute that privilege to? And are we supposed to cap everybody at a certain amount of privilege? And then how do you get to privileges such as, Scott, like in your case, the parents and such? Should your parents be regulated as to how good of parents they are and somehow redistribute that parenthood to other people with not as good parenthoods? So it's
that what the public schools are trying to do today?
Yes, 100%.
Getting on a real slippery slope there, right? Redistributing of privilege.
And is that not what it implies? In between the lines with this question that I find is that you're disparaging someone for a certain amount of privilege. Okay, well, if that's bad, then let's get at it.
Then what do we? How do we?
don't want something bad to exist.
Well, I guess that I would see it perhaps a little bit differently.
I'm shocked.
Right. For those of us who have had privilege, to the extent that we have privilege to spare, so to speak, how are we reaching those who aren't given that privilege and pulling them up? Because to me, that is the dream. Right?
So you're saying so as opposed to some third party coming in and redistributing privilege, whatever that.
I'm not down for that at all.
I'm not sure how that works exactly, but so you're saying it's on the people.
It's on the individual.
It's on certain people to try to pull other people.
And from our last conversation on this podcast that I'm a big fan of taking ownership of your own life,
right?
Stepping up, and a part of that is being generous and sharing to the extent that you can the privilege that you've been afforded in life.
So I've read this comment a couple times now. It's the first time I've seen this, right? So
it's not a long read.
No, but to your point, depending on how you think about it, it sort of changes the challenge.
Yeah.
So one way to think about what is his I don't know
Banana
Shit's view of the American dream.
Yeah.
And as part of that view, one of the implications to me of this comment is that to achieve the American dream, you have to overcome something. So how can you talk about saving the American dream if you've never had to overcome anything to achieve the American dream?
Okay. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, her point here please, or her. I don't know why.
I don't know. It's because of the little. It's because of the little kiss emojis making you think it's a her.
Please stop talking. You don't. There's nothing for you to talk about because you haven't had to achieve. You haven't actually had to try to strive to achieve this dream. So why would you?
But I think so that's valid, except that the judgment comes in where you assume that because of my skin color and orientation, automatically I haven't had any challenges. Whereas, in fact,
there's the judgment, right?
Or to your point, or that I can't worry about what that means for my society. So there's nothing to say that I'm an engineer, specifically a software engineer. One of our tenets as a software engineer is you leave the code better than you found it, right? You go wandering into a piece of code for whatever reason, and you have a task to do. Part of your task is to leave things better off than when you found it. From a personal perspective, I don't think that's any different than approaching life.
Yeah.
And I'm not necessarily going to give someone a job because they're underprivileged. But I'm certainly going to give everyone who walks through my door looking for a position every chance that they can to prove themselves that they can do this job. And I mean, it's.
By the way, Dr. Taj is coming back to talk about affirmative action.
Yeah.
If you guys saw him.
Cool.
Yeah. So, no, fair enough. All right, so let's do a little segue there. But this is a perfect example of if we were raising kids today, this is one example of many things, I think, that when our kids were little, or even, I don't know about maybe in high school, but it's certainly in junior high, in their younger years, elementary school, like we didn't really have to, like that, this whole conversation we just had wasn't even really something that we needed to worry about. So there's what?
It's not something that we had, right?
Right.
And it's not something perhaps that we had to quote unquote worry about because we're cis white men.
Right.
Right. But if you're non-cis, if you're non-white, if you're not a man, perhaps that growing up at whatever era of raising kids was a different conversation.
Well, and actually that's a piece of it that I want to get into because on the one hand I look and I go, we have a lot of complexities, and that's really the point I was getting at, is there's complexities now that I didn't when I had little kids. I had other shit to think about, but I didn't have those complexities to worry about and how to educate. Let's hey Trev, pull up that APA, the American Psychology Association article. So this is, I think this will kind of help us grease the skids a little bit on what we want to talk about. Now this is just one report rather. You can find lots of headlines right now about the concerns about kids' mental health. But this was when was this from? What does it say? Oh, January this year. So this is recent. If you scroll down, Trev, to okay, but no, first paragraph. All right. Now, the one thing that you hear about in the headlines a lot of times right now is, it's because of COVID that our kids are having all of these problems with anxiety and depression and this, that, and the other. But actually, what they say here is, if you look at that last sentence on the first paragraph, U.S. children and teens have been suffering for far longer. In the last 10 years leading up to the pandemic, feelings of persistent sadness and hopelessness, suicidal thoughts and behaviors increased by 40%. That is not trivial.
No, that's not insignificant.
And then they go on to say we're seeing really high rates of all these. Most of it is about anxiety, depression, and in that one let's see. There we go, right there. All these difficulties on top of growing concerns about social media, mass violence, natural disasters, climate change, political polar. All of this is apparently anxiety provoking and creating a mental health. I mean, I have read recently about young people who wake up every morning and spend the first 60 minutes reading the climate report on Reddit or climate reports, different climate change reports on Reddit, and spend the rest of their day in feelings of anxiety, anger, guilt, right, all of these things, and that's actually not just kids. That's even people in their own. So, I have some thoughts about this. But what
has changed in the past 10 years?
Yeah,
in the past 10 years, maybe a little bit longer than that, the access to information has just gone exponential.
So is the quality of information.
Yeah.
Well, and the lack of quality there as well.
Yeah.
But I think that may be. So the very first thing that I kind of react to on this is, what's the underlying data? How is the 40%?
Of course.
Achieved, designated, where they designate a 10-year time horizon. Okay, so how do they start measuring it in the first part of that 10 years? What was the inflection point?
But this isn't like Politico. This is the American Psychology Association.
Sure.
So I got to believe that there's some sort of credit.
There's got to be some science behind that. You would imagine. But I think at least in the past 10 years, absolutely the access to information in a mobile device in our kids' hands has changed their ability to tap into media. By and large, is feeding them a bunch of the sky is falling type
Is
stuff.
it access to information, or is it information being sort of thrust upon them?
I think it's access.
Isn't it kind of both? I mean, the fact that they have easily accessible information, and then the fire hose of information that's coming across all those media types, you can't help it, right? You're going to get, if you get onto any social media, if you're how many alerts you've got, it's this constant barrage of information, be it edited and checked or simply opinion, right? They get it all.
Well, and even if it's accurate, maybe it's not great for a fourth grader.
Right.
Right? Like, I was thinking about this because I thought about this, and I thought, okay, but this is not the first time in history where there's been a lot of severe things going on in the world. When our kids were little, I think we had some of mine. Y2K, there was 9/11, there was the economic collapse that happened after Y2K and 9/11 and the war in Iraq. They didn't necessarily, it's not that they weren't aware of those things entirely, but those things weren't really present to them in a way that they woke up in the morning worrying about it.
Right.
Right.
They had to actually turn on the tube and watch it.
Yeah.
But I don't know that that's I don't know that that's bad. I don't know that having access to the information or even a fire hose of information is necessarily bad. But back to the topic, I think a lot of this goes to parenting. So understanding, and this is not an easy thing to do, but it's certainly something I would do differently if I had children today. Really paying attention to what they were, and not necessarily restricting it, but paying attention to what is it that they're reading and why are they reading it, and having that conversation about what are you reading and how is it making you feel. If they're stressed about the environment, fair play to them. But for me as a parent, the conversation becomes, what are you going to do about it? Instead of sitting here fretting about it, reading whatever,
Right.
Let's together figure out, is it accurate? B, let's figure out a plan. Because the only way this is going to change is if someone stands up to change it. Who's to say that child, my child, whoever's child, isn't a scientist 10 years down the road,
Right.
because of their upbringing, that says, I'm going to bring meaningful change to whatever problem it is that's stressing them out. The stress might be real. Like, it might be valid.
Yeah. Sure, it's not. I don't think you get to this 40% of or whatever that was by it being like all bullshit.
Well,
Like,
but
no,
it might even be valid stress, right?
Right,
I mean,
that's what I mean,
might have real
yeah.
concerns.
Right.
Well, all that stress is valid stress, right?
Well, what they're like, it might not be misinformation.
Right.
Whatever it is they're stressed about
yeah.
might actually be happening in the world and might need to be addressed.
Well, I think that you absolutely hit the nail on the head. It's acknowledge that stress, acknowledge the thing that they're concerned about, and have a conversation with them.
Yeah.
Talk to them about it. Look,
But then act. But I think
that's great.
I think it's as a parent, I think it's not quite a cop out. it's easy to say in hindsight, have the conversation. Like, we always say that in society, right? We should have more conversations, and we should. We should have more reasonable conversations.
That's the whole idea behind the show, in spite of the fact that I'm unqualified to have these conversations.
But if you're talking about these sorts of things, right? It's one thing to acknowledge the concern, the anxiety.
Yeah.
Another, have a conversation, and as especially as the male in my family dynamic. Frankly, it's kind of a traditional role. You go to work, like, you get a little tuned out sometimes. So it's one thing for me coming home from work, sitting down, listening to my children, and having a conversation, and then another to take the time to enact whatever bullshit I was yapping at them, to actually not make it bullshit. To say,
Right. Yeah.
If we're going to spend our weekend, whatever. Cleaning the rivers or
planting trees,
whatever it might be. What is the action, and how do I, as a parent, help enact that action to make change in my kid's life? I mean, frankly, for me, politics and a lot of things start around my kitchen table. So, being selfish, I'd be looking at how am I helping my child, and if I'm helping my child by alleviate their stress by going out and planting trees, I'm probably doing it more for my child than I am for any other reason.
Yeah.
And that might lead to meaningful change. More power to my to my kid for doing that.
That you still have a kitchen table around which things happen is impressive. I like that.
We actually have a kitchen table, so we're like sitting in the kitchen, right,
at the
where
table.
we're sitting with the counter and the whole 9 yards.
So what I'm hearing from you guys though is the same. It sounds like the same parenting, the same, whatever it was that you did when your kids were little, those same practices are the situation today wouldn't require you. If all of a sudden you both went home after this show and your wife looks in and goes, honey, guess what? It's really just about running the same playbook as what you ran the first time.
When you first asked that question about what would we do now, my initial thought was, I really don't think I would do anything differently. And it is the kitchen table conversation. So we made it a practice as a family to sit around the table and have a dinner every night, as long as I wasn't traveling for work or something like that. So
then they were at Sonic.
Maybe, or Chick-fil-A or something like that. So, but if we were all in the same place, we were having dinner together, and we were talking about what was going on during that day. Television was off, phones were put away.
Right.
We're having a conversation, and whatever topic came up, we talked through, we worked through, and we're not psychologists.
It sounds simplistic, and when I was younger, I thought it was kind of, just an easy thing to say. Oh, you sit down, you need to sit down and have dinner with your family, and we didn't actually consciously, as a family, we didn't consciously try to do this. Don't get me wrong. I mean, we kind of fell into place, and we were on the run all the time. We were going to athletic practices or school events, and we were always moving. But when we sat down, we sat down together, and just started talking.
Yeah,
and it does happen. Now, back to banana shit. I come from, my family itself is privileged, and hard work, but we have, my wife and I have been together for a long time, and so there's always been two of us. There's always been two of us parenting. There's always been two of us involved, and we've switched roles as we went from good cop to bad cop, or whatever it might be, and it's easier. And I know a lot of single parent families, and my hat goes off to any single parent who's doing their damnedest to pull all that together.
Yeah, that is a privilege, right?
I don't know that I could do it on my own.
It is a privilege to have been in a long-term relationship. So Monica and I just celebrated 30 years of marriage. We've been together for much longer than that. You've been married for
35.
Yeah, so that consistency in the two parents.
Wait, what year is this?
I mean, we'll have to ask Trevor.
35. 35. Yeah.
Trevor may have a different perspective on this.
8 and 5 is 3. So yeah, 35.
But I mean, that consistency and that partnership in that home my parents are divorced. So,
Yeah.
you know, talking about overcoming something that was very stressful for myself and my brother at the time, that's a hardship that anybody goes through that's going to put a lot of stress in
My
your
parents are
life.
divorced as well. They divorced when I was in college, which most people would think that.
Yeah.
that
Doesn't have any impact. Yeah, but yeah.
but it really did. It was,
Yeah.
It was. And it's impacted my thinking towards my family a lot,
Sure.
even as adults or at 18.
Yeah.
It can really impact you.
All right. I want to ask a hard question now. Well, the easy question is whether I need to go make Corey another old fashioned.
Yeah, he's ahead of me.
But it was easier when the bar cart was right here because I
Right.
could just get up
Stand
and
up,
do it.
yeah.
It was becoming too unwieldy in here.
We should have just made one in advance.
We should have just made a round. An extra round. What if? Now this is granted this is hypothetical, but it's my show, so I can do what I want.
Yeah, absolutely.
What if
we can always buck that trend.
Right.
it's true.
There's two of us over here.
Yeah, it's true. What if we all of a sudden we found that
We're expecting.
honey, guess what? And we said, no problem. I know how to do this. The world has changed, but it's all about having conversations at the kitchen table and taking action and doing all that good things that you said. And what if, though, now, because while I'm convinced that you could look back through any period of history, American history or anybody's history, right? But this show's about America, so that's all we care about. You can look at any period of history, and there's always, like I said, severe things going on in society. There's natural disasters. There was a whole period with civil rights in this country. There was
Y2K.
Y2K was big. We did have the what was it? Was it the Hong Kong flu back when I think when you and I were kids.
Yeah.
I think you might be a little younger, but that was like late 60s,
yeah.
early 70s, the Hong Kong flu.
Yeah.
Remarkably,
I forgot about that.
that was another one where not everyone died.
Yeah.
But I'm convinced that I don't know whether the things happening today are more severe or more difficult or more complex or more, because some of it's not just about bad shit happening, right? But there's a lot more. There's a whole thing now. Climate therapy, like I was mentioning before, is a whole new discipline in psychology. You got like all the gender stuff that people are trying to deal with their kids and all this. So I am convinced that whether things are more complicated now or not, I think they're certainly more disruptive and invasive in the minds of kids than they were before. They go to school, like they're confronted with stuff more, I think, at least than when my kids were younger.
Well, yeah, I think that we talked
about the information and
right?
all that. So, so all that's to say, what if all of a sudden you find out you're having a kid a few years down the road, kids in elementary school, whatever, and you realize that the tried and true kitchen table conversations aren't
cutting it.
the kids coming home from school going, they still have anxiety, they're still confused because what's happening in their environment is so much more difficult or more intense or more what have you than, and that's the part when I thought about what would I do differently now, what I thought about was this is a whole new set, like this is a whole new level of intensity in terms of the challenges. Would I need to do anything more or additional or differently to maintain, like to keep
So are you
my
thinking
kids
like
on the
homeschooling or?
I don't
something?
know. I didn't actually have any. Well, actually, I do have a couple of ideas, but I'm curious what you guys think.
I personally, I don't. We've got a couple of young engineers who are having their first kid, and the only advice I give them is don't listen to anybody.
Any
Don't
advice.
listen to the experts. Put the damn book down. You actually know what needs to be done. You know that kid better than anyone else who can tell you,
That's
and
true.
you know what's right and wrong intuitively. Like people say, there's no instruction book, but I believe as humans that we actually know. As parents, we actually do know And
Yeah.
and so I tell them, even me, like, don't listen to anybody. Don't listen to the parents who are telling you that they're putting their kid in, 6 after school programs because your kid's going to fall behind if you don't. Like, don't pay any attention to them at all. They're just trying to justify their own decisions, and their decisions are theirs. God bless them. Go ahead, do what you need to do. But most importantly, just listen to yourself and do what you know is right. And for me, in that situation, if I had a young child right now coming home from grade school, I would hope that I would take my own advice. And I don't know what I would do, but I would listen to myself in the moment as to what is right for that child. And I'm not sure I know what I would change.
That's fantastic, right? Be empathetic, be intuitive, trust your gut. Perhaps, don't panic, don't freak out. Maybe be introspective and say, here's what I'm capable of handling as a parent. Here's what I'm capable of bringing to my child. And if perhaps that's not working, there could be some professional help to seek. And look, it wasn't so long ago where that wouldn't even come out of my mouth. That would never occur to me to go and have a conversation with someone to provide mental and emotional support for my child.
It's intriguing to me because I've only ever known the enlightened Corey. I'm always very curious what the pre-enlightened Corey was like.
Well, that's a different podcast.
So I think for me, one thing that would be the most difficult for me is, so there are certain things now that people care a great deal about that, and there's some argument to be made. In fact, last week we were in here with Dan Alford, and he was commenting on how, it was actually echoing comments from, what was the name of that guy that wrote the writer, Trev? It was a book that he'd been reading. You remember the guy's name? Anyway, it's not important. He's like, I don't know. And this guy was saying that basically we were talking about societies in decline, whole other subject. But this guy's done a lot of work in this field, and he said, one of the things that you see is a common characteristic in societies, the great societies and civilizations in decline, is they begin to care too much about the wrong things, and they get preoccupied with shit that doesn't matter, in so many words. And meanwhile, there's things that really do matter, and
those bite them.
And in some cases, it's because, like, one example is, there was in the kind of in the trajectory of Rome, there was a point at which they had no more enemies, right? And society became preoccupied with, and so he gave some examples about that. Anyway, I think today I look at a lot of things that people are all continuously worked up about, and I'm not gonna mention any specifics because I don't want to get off on I don't want banana shit to go off on me. But in my mind, there are things today that, coming from my generation, I look and I go, why are we spending so much time worrying about this? It just doesn't matter. To quote Bill Murray, just doesn't matter. Do you remember that? What was that? It was meatballs, right? Meatballs. Just doesn't matter. Now, I may be wrong about some of those things. Maybe they do matter. But the point is, it'd be hard for me at this point in my life with a kid who's coming home with all these things that they're worried about, because this is what their world is worried about. And I'm going to have to So the beginning of this rant, I said one of the things that's hard for me, or I think would be hard for me, is like shifting out of that. Well, who the hell cares about that? It doesn't matter because it's real to them, right? And having to adjust my frame of mind and my way of thinking to say, however ridiculous I think this is, it's real to people now.
Right.
That would be a tough one. It's easy for you because this is the post-enlightened Corey.
No, but I think
this is the pre-enlightened Michael that we're dealing with.
But I think it would be. I think that would be difficult.
You
for
know what I'm
anyone.
getting at, though, right?
Well, anybody that has a kid, and you're supposed to be obviously the parent that is the final authority, the
All-knowing.
one who has the answers, the one who can help, and they're bringing something to you, and you just basically say, "That's immaterial," blow it off, and move on. It'd be a natural inclination for me to do exactly that.
Yeah.
That is
Doesn't matter.
a meaningless topic. Let's drop it. Let's move on.
Like, you don't need to worry about it.
Yeah.
But then they go back to school and all their friends are
They're
worried
worried about
and their teachers are worried about it, right? And all that. So I think that would be.
It would take an adjustment.
It's not to make it sound too simple, but my natural question would be, well, why are you worried about it? Like, what's like? This is not.
This is the engineer right here.
Right.
That's right.
And
I like it.
I'm pretty. My kids always knew, like, if they did something wrong or had a bad game or whatever, I didn't. I was like, man, you didn't do well today. Like, that was not up to par for you. And so they also knew that if I said you had a good day, they probably had a pretty good day. So I'm okay with looking at my kids going, like, that doesn't matter to me. Not that it shouldn't matter to you, but tell me why it matters to you, because it does not matter to me.
Well, I'll piggyback on something you said earlier, and then follow it up with, and what are we going to do?
What are we going to do about it? Yeah.
Right. I mean, what action are we going to actually legitimately take within our span of control or span of influence that is going to make a difference?
Right.
Or is it just something that is part of the landscape, and we need to understand how to process that and deal with it and
there's a lot of that.
Right? And accept that it's part of the noise in the environment.
Well, so we could go a step further than that, which is because I was thinking about this recently when I was reading about young people who are paralyzed with anxiety over, the planet becoming uninhabitable in the next 5 minutes. And more so, and also feeling guilt, like, because the question of what are you going to do about it, in some cases, in that particular issue, is causing, and this is maybe more so for like teenagers through 20s, right, where they're really preoccupied and we have to do something about it. We have to do something about it. We have to do something about it. I think the question that I would like to pose, like if I had a teenager now who was really having anxiety about that, is, okay, let's pretend for just a second that, and this is going to get me thrown off YouTube, but let's pretend for just a second that climate is changing, it's getting bad, and there's nothing we can do about it. Not a damn thing. Doesn't matter. You can buy all your stuff secondhand. You can stop driving a car. Doesn't matter.
It's on a roll. It's headed that way.
The clock is ticking, and that's where we're going. Now, let's just pretend that that's true for just a second. Now, how do we want to live?
You're asking the same question, right?
Right. So instead of being preoccupied with saving the planet, because we can't.
Right.
Again, hypothetical.
Right.
Yeah.
It's going down that path. Let's assume that.
As humans now, what should our life be about? And because whatever the answer to that question is probably what we should be about.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's probably the greater good. If you think about, like, what's the greater good? Saving the planet for future generations, or whatever the answer is to what we ought to be about. If there's nothing that we could do, like, that's probably it. Not that we should do one and not the other, but we shouldn't do. But we shouldn't do one. But we shouldn't do one without the other.
Right. Well, you got to cross that bridge on if, right?
Right.
If you can't do anything about it. If you actually legitimately cross that bridge, then what are we going to be about?
So the possibilities are we all descend into nihilism, right? And life has no meaning.
Or hedonism.
Right. So those are probably not the good answers.
Right.
So, but my point is that whatever the question of what ought we to be, if there's nothing we could do about saving the planet, what should we be about? We should be thinking about that irrespective of whether we can save the planet. Because that's about being, and
I don't think those are mutually exclusive.
that's my point, right? But I think that by thinking too much about these things that we can't control, we have a generation that's missing out on becoming the sort of people that we ought to be, irrespective of whether we can control.
But there is an
certain
element of saying these are things that we can control. So you can't just necessarily, unless you've proven all the mathematics and the climate models, to say there's nothing we can do. Until that is proven, there are things theoretically we can do.
Correct.
Right? I'm not saying, again, that these are mutually exclusive.
Yeah, I guess. Okay, let me take another crack at this. I'm not saying it right. If you ask the question, if you just pretend for a second that there isn't anything we can do about it,
Yeah.
then now what should our life be like?
Yeah. And I'm not saying
Whatever
again,
our life should be like in that case,
those are not mutually exclusive.
is what we are, right. But what I'm saying is, if you're so worried about this thing over here,
You can't do this.
that you
first-
can't do this,
Yeah, I understand.
I'm tracking with you now.
yeah,
Yeah.
like just for 5 minutes, get your head off of
Right.
worrying about the planet's
And
demise.
what is this important thing?
And because if we solve the problem of what ought our life be like,
Then maybe we can address the other piece.
yeah, it's about priorities. I think
Yeah.
that's what I'm getting at.
No, that's good.
What do you think, Corey?
That's good. I'll go with that.
I don't know that it's about priorities, though. I think it's about being actionable. So, leaving whatever you think about whatever the problem is, climate change, whatever it might be. If you, I think our first step in society is to behave in the way that we need to behave as individuals, and in doing so, the rest won't take care of itself. But it gives you a pathway to take care of the other things. So if you're conscious about how is it we should be behaving in this society, how do I help the next person, and not I'm all for a free market, right? I'm in it to make a buck as well as anyone else. But how do I help the next person along? How do I leave things a little better than they were? How do I
Right.
if you can focus on living that life, right, which I think is where you're driving at, the other things start to take place. Like simple things, like you probably won't litter. Like you'll probably pick up the bottle on the side of the road just because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
It's just ugly to begin with. And things get a little bit better. If everyone starts living in that mode, then these bigger questions that we're arguing about, struggling with, fighting about, some half believe, half don't, start to make more sense from the standpoint of how do I make that better? Can I make it better by simply listening to the other side and starting to understand where their concerns are? And can I do things, even if I don't necessarily believe in what's going on, that makes their life a little bit better?
Yeah.
Does it cost me anything to recycle if I believe in what's going on with the recycling or not? But if it helps my neighbor feel better, if it helps me have a conversation with my neighbor because we're both recycling, and it's no cost to me, well, what the hell?
Yeah.
But I think you hit on it. It's how do you define that mode within which we should all behave? And everyone's lens on that is going to be different.
Yeah.
Every single person. So
Yeah.
the way I choose to behave may be dramatically different from anyone else, and some of my behaviors may be entirely unacceptable to other people.
Might be.
Fair, but if we're not necessarily trying to solve the problem of society as a whole, but we're just trying to solve the problem of how do I raise my kids, then I think what I would do, if I had to do it again now, is I would spend more time with them on things that are a matter of principle, things that are, your kids are young and you spend a lot of time helping them navigate whatever situation is there or whatever, or trying to get them to do whatever it is that they're not doing, or trying to get them to stop whatever it is that they're not, right? But I think I would go back to, and this is going to sound counterintuitive, perhaps some people, I would go back to a more what I consider to be an old-fashioned way of thinking and teaching the younger generation, which is probably the simplest way I can say it is more John Wayne. So I don't know if you guys are John Wayne fans, and I know there's a lot of criticisms that we could throw out there about John Wayne, or that most of those are mischaracterizations, but I'm talking about it more in the story sense. So this is what you do. This is how we live. These are the principles. This is right. This is wrong.
Right, this is right, yeah.
You know, you need to be more John Wayne to me means more living and doing things by the code.
So you're
right?
anchoring around a set of principles or a set of beliefs,
right?
And saying, whatever situation you, my child, are dealing with, let's kind of get back to the founding principles and how would we deal with this or process the situation
Right.
under those terms.
Principles and qualities like integrity, like courage, like
The virtues.
virtues. Yeah. More emphasis just on those things in and of themselves, which I think that I look back and I go, didn't spend a lot of, like, those things are kind of in the back of your mind, but didn't really orient around those things. I think I would orient around those things more, because what you're trying to create is a more secure compass.
So
Trevor's got that.
It's the old. We don't see this anymore. But what would Jesus do?
well, I was going to say, other than John Wayne, where are you going to get these principles?
Well, I think it doesn't matter. Or no. Well, hold on. Let me answer that. But
Yes,
Trevor, what did you have?
Well, just trying to go off that to kind of clarify what we're getting at is, are there objective, fundamental principles and characteristics that are necessary and applicable to everyone? And if there are, then what are they?
Yeah.
And philosophers and theologians have been talking about this for thousands of years.
But here, I'm going to throw like a flag on the play. If you're asking me to solve the problem of society, that's one question. If you're asking me how am I going to raise my kids,
It's a much easier question. Because you can
the
pick
right
whatever-
principles and characteristics are whatever I think.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
But are there objective ones?
No.
Yeah.
Have you looked up the definition of morality?
Yeah, it's a long one.
Yeah, but it's also centered around what is acceptable in the society you're in.
Right.
There isn't, if you just look at the definition, it's not around what is fundamentally right or wrong. It's what society, the definition of morality is what has society
chosen to be
to
acceptable.
be right or wrong.
So then what if we start with, to strip down the basics of society and our children, that's life. So then how do we value life? Can life be valued to an objective level? I feel like that is the most fundamental you can get, and then that's how you build off of that. Because everything that we're discussing here, the principles and such, what you think is right or what you think is valuable, is dependent on how you treat the life of your own and of others. So fundamentally, I think it starts with how we value life. And then you can get into, that's where you can start with looking for objective principles. Because there's got to be objective principles, because we've seen there are right ways to do things and wrong ways to do things, i.e. constructive ways and destructive ways.
He throws out a few sometimes that are
Pretty good.
you kind of have to think a little bit. How do we value life? All right. So
Can you get more basic
To take
strip
a-
down then?
Well, I was going to say, if you use the constructive versus destructive concepts there, something that is constructive to me may be destructive to someone else. It's advantageous to me and disadvantage
So
to
should
someone.
it be constructive to everybody, or should we?
And there are
certain
and I think there are
people or
plenty of
ideas that
those
should be.
plenty of those thought experiments where you run into a situation where you're going to run over the lady with that's pushing the baby carriage,
Right.
or you're going to run over the 5 grown people over here. And you have a choice, one or the other. And it's going to be destructive to someone and constructive to the
But
other.
then before that, you have to figure out how you assess and value the life in order to make that decision.
So all right, so let me like ratchet back from there that point and say, if I were looking at this as a parent, what I really want to do, if I'm looking at today, I would say, and not that this is a new concept, but I would think more about building the compass in my kid than I would trying to address all these various different things.
Not actually building the compass, but helping them build their compass.
Their compass, right. So the question then becomes, and so to put something kind of halfway between my I don't give a shit about everybody else and your what's the right thing for everybody, somewhere in the middle there is if I'm wanting to help my kids build that right, and it's not just a moral compass, but it's something that enables them to live life in a way that they're not going to suffer from anxiety and depression and incapacity and right? And this goes back to my John Wayne analogy. He never didn't know what to, like the characters that he played in movies, they never didn't know what to do, right? Never didn't know what to do. It was always, sometimes it was really hard and it was really difficult and it wasn't necessarily good for everybody, but they always knew what to do. And so if that's what you really want your kid, then the question becomes, well, but we do want to have some, we want those principles, those qualities, those virtues to be something that is somewhat objectively beneficial to, like, you don't want to raise like a little Napoleon.
Yeah,
right?
I guess we go back to the article,
So-
right? So, if we go back to the article, we're saying 10 years ago we had an inflection point that started a trend towards 40% of the population.
Shit show, yeah.
Right? And so there's an element that we diagnosed out of that saying that, there's the exposure, the access to information, and the access to really a lot of negative information kind of hit an inflection point 10
Right.
years ago. And were there other complicating factors that came into play? Was it a move away from the John Wayne set of principles where folks no longer had an anchoring point to some sort of
Right.
of philosophical beliefs that allowed them to convey that to the kids? Or was it that and or them not actually having conversations with the kids as they were growing up so that they're building that philosophical foundation, that set of principles in their children over time so that 10 years later they're not suffering from anxiety because they're able to process that better. So I think that there may be multiple complicating factors
Yeah,
playing
I'd
in.
venture to guess it isn't one.
Sure.
If you actually were able to sort out all the inputs, it's not one dominating input.
For sure. But if I had to, if I were, and really, I guess what I'm saying is, this approach would, the more I look back on like everything that I've seen in life so far, and I see what we're doing, it's not so much that I would do something different now. It's that I think maybe a better approach, certainly now and probably even then, instead of spending so much kitchen table time talking about what's going on and how to interpret and understand all of these things. Not that we would leave that out entirely, although I thought that the village idea was kind of cool. The M. Night Shyamalan where they went off and like made their own town that was like separate from the world, and it was like 100 years. Like there was something to be said for that. But not that I would. But I think I might pull back from spending so much time trying to navigate all the things and put more emphasis on whatever are, as a parent, whatever you think are the right qualities, attributes, principles, right? Like the sort of things that you live by, no matter what's happening. Like,
but
this
all
is
of those,
what I live
all
by.
of those events are the use cases whereby you apply those attributes.
Absolutely, right.
So the time around the dinner table for us was, I'll say that we had some kind of grounding principles that we lived by, whether or not we truly and explicitly articulated those. When we were around the dinner table, whatever the topic was,
It's seeping into
it's coming out in the conversation.
Right.
Hey, you don't lie about things.
Right.
Right. So I know that your buddy over there is trying to get you to do something that is a little bit shady, and you don't go steal. Or, fundamental.
And those were the easy problems back then.
Sure.
Now it's like, what about and I would love to get your wife's input on this sometime, being a teacher. What about I have a teacher who's trying to inject ideology into the classroom that some people might be dandy with and I'm not?
Well, and I think that's a great scenario where the child has an open communication enough with the parent. That's an adult situation to deal with.
Right.
But a little off topic. You want to make a difference in your community, especially at the polls, make sure you vote on your
School board.
It's
Yeah.
You want to have something impact your daily life, your school board,
Much more
and
so
the
than your
decisions they
senators.
make
Yeah.
will impact your daily
Yeah.
life tomorrow
Yeah.
than anything happening in Washington.
Yeah.
And I've seen it happen. So, I mean, to that point, right? Yeah, go talk to you got to go deal with it as a parent if you think that's actually happening. But if you really want to make change, go get involved with the school board, and things will change. It's scary both ways.
Yeah.
frankly.
Yeah.
But the message around the dinner table was still the same, right?
Right, yeah, fair, yeah.
The child had some grounding principles that they felt like were being stepped on a bit in the classroom, and they also understood that they had an open dialogue point with their parent. Let's air that out.
Well, I think there's a little nuance there that's really important, which is the reason why the kid felt that their principles were being stepped on is because they had a firm grasp of those principles
an
in
idea
the
of what
first
they were-
place, right? So, and that's another thing I think which I would probably emphasize if I were raising children now. I would probably emphasize more as not being so malleable, right? Not you don't have to like that like being who you are and like it's one thing to be open-minded. It's something else to be so malleable that you sort of, and of course we all like, there's nothing new about raising your kids to know who they are and have confidence and all that, but I think it's more intense now maybe because it used to be you were just trying to keep them from following, like little Johnny or Susie, whoever who was a troublemaker, and you didn't want them you didn't want them to run with the wrong crowd. Now it's more like all these forces competing for ideologically, right?
So I think, sitting here thinking about it, I think if I had a child who was coming home stressed and like to the point of being inactionable, like they were just worried about everything and not, one of my advice to them would be make a decision. Choose for yourself, whatever it is, but choose for yourself how you're going to respond to this. Instead of getting caught in indecision because you're getting information from every direction, make a decision. Doesn't mean you can't change your decision later on, but make a decision and then move forward with the information you have in front of you. It's a bit of a cliche, but we all make decisions based on the information we have at hand, and we go on. I think if I had a child who was sort of paralyzed in fear, anxiety, indecision, one of my advice to them would be face it. Make a decision. If you don't make a decision, someone else will make the decision for you. I guarantee it. And even if it's no decision, time passes, a decision is made.
Well, getting back to virtues, what you're describing is
It goes back to the John Wayne thing, right?
Right.
Because one of the things that crossed my mind is in the movies, of course, he always knows exactly what to do. And in real life, it's not really the case. It's back to the parent. You don't actually really know what to do. You just make a decision and go with the best information you have at
Which
hand.
in and of itself is
And it looks like you know
it's
exactly
kind of a
what to
virtue.
do.
Like
Right.
knowing it's an attribute. It's something that you say. I mean, that's probably a combination of like courage and good judgment.
Yeah.
But part of that conversation I would have then, now thinking about it, what I would do differently is, why would you make that decision? What do you think happens beyond that point of decision?
Let's walk this forward a little
Yeah,
bit and see where you
let's
end
have
up.
let's have that conversation about, where does this take you? What does that path give you as an outcome? And help them to process that.
Yeah.
It's the game theory, right?
Yeah.
How do I walk? I'm going to make a move. How do I walk? How do I walk this forward? And where's the most logical place I end up? And is that a place I want to be?
There's something to be said for also not overanalyzing it.
Totally.
And
And
we know
sometimes
that.
letting them stub their toe.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you learn, you learn way more when you hit your thumb with the hammer than all the calculating that you do in advance about how to not hit your thumb with the hammer, right?
You
So
only touch a hot stove once,
yeah. So yeah.
On purpose.
right? On.
Yeah. So what have we figured out here? Basically, well, I think one thing that is we haven't explicitly said, but it's evident in all the commentary. You got kids got to have parents, right? And in fact, one of the things that was in that report, that American Psychology report, we don't need to bring it up, but when you read through, it gets to, okay, so what are we doing about this,
Yeah.
right? And the answer among the professionals is more programs, more various agency and organizational, and it just sounds like more government, bureaucracy stepping in to try to deal with these struggles, which more institutionalized, really, is what I should say. More, whether it's the schools or whether it's the government or whether it's some professional organization, but it's a more institutionalized approach to solving the problem, which is kind of our national trend these days, as opposed to no, it's like we need more, we need parents.
Well, I was going to say, what is the diagnosis for that situation? Is it parenting?
No, they didn't say that.
No, but I'm saying that for us. I mean, is it better parenting in some way, or is it all these programs, or is it some third alternative that we haven't discussed?
Well, I think it is parenting, but unfortunately, it kind of goes back to shit banana, right?
Right, banana shit.
Banana shit. It's not always easy,
No,
right?
it's never
You look
easy.
at the
Well, at
divorce
first
rate
you
in
have
our
to be
country,
present, right?
right?
Got
It's not easy
to be there.
Be present,
and-
communicate.
Yeah.
And for the single parent, I mean, leaving the idea of being present out of it, for the single parent, no matter how present they are, it's difficult.
Still harder. Yeah.
Well, it's still half.
And as a society, I think we, without sort of throwing money at the problem, and without necessarily the whole idea of a village to raise a child, while I believe there's some truth in that, it starts with the parents. So I'm all for, as a society, helping build those kind of relationships, even in where the nucleus of the family is starting to break down.
Well, yeah, because the village to raise a child thing, the village isn't an institution. It's a bunch of
People
that you know.
people that you know that have a relationship that it's
I'll tell you, one of the proudest
people helping
things
people.
That
when
share
I
the
was-
same values.
Yeah.
When I was a young father, I was coaching athletics, and one of the I didn't expect this, but one of the proudest things was on Father's Day one year, one of the players sent me a Happy Father's Day note coming from a single mother, and I was floored by the notion that he would even consider me as a father figure. But he did without me even realizing it, right? Just by showing up, showing concern, being there.
See, that's the village principle.
Right? Exactly. And I think that's important in this world, right? There are other places for young adults, young children to receive information, to receive that parenting than just at the home. And I believe that is the most important thing we can do. The most important thing happens in the home. It's one of our biggest problems in public school, frankly, is how those children are getting help at home to help our public school situation. And it's the most important thing that happens. But there are other places, and I think there are places in society that aren't necessarily government driven that we can help and make those lives better. But just by simply, it goes back to what you were saying, by simply being the right person in society, right? You don't have to go out there thinking I'm going to be a role model. All you have to do is go out and be the type of person that you want to be, and people will gravitate.
All that you can be.
That didn't really resonate with either one of us. I prefer aim high. Thank you.
But so we could segue into a whole sequel episode about the right attitudes and qualities in society, that like how all that comes together. And actually going back to something Trevor said too, which was, well, when we were kind of straddling the well, am I trying to figure out what's right for me and my kid, or am I trying to fix the problem of society? And ultimately all those things come together.
Of course.
But Scott, what you just said about go out there and be a certain type of person, that kind of assumes that that's important to you, right? Like that we're not, so that we actually do care about, well, let me say that this way. One of the weird paradoxes, I think, I mean, they're all weird, I guess, but one of them that I see happening right now is everybody is all worried about what's happening in the world, but people aren't so worried about what's happening with the person next
door to them,
right? Or themselves,
or themselves, right? So I'm not really caring. I'm not overly caring about my fellow man or woman, but I am really worried about what they're all doing. I'm mad about what's happening in the world, but I'm not overly caring about the people that are around me. Do you know what I'm saying? I'm not explaining that really well.
But. No, you are.
You get triggered by the news headlines, perhaps.
Right.
But your neighbor right next door may be struggling with some things that you could easily at least be an ear for. And we have this blinder on because we're so distracted by, somebody blew up the bridge in Crimea. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Don't get me started.
Yeah. Topic.
Yeah. So that could be, we might have to do a whole nother. If we go long enough, we'll just fix all the problems.
Well, we got to boil down all those principles from John Wayne first.
Yeah.
That's critically important.
I know it's funny, but
I think you hit on something.
So this is an interesting thing. I'll throw this in and then we can kind of wrap up. But so I grew up a teenager in the 80s. Probably, Scott, you probably were. I don't know. Were you right? All right. So the 80s, if you were a young person, was not a time of traditional role models, right? It was really, it wasn't cool. John Wayne was not cool in the 80s.
No.
Right?
No.
Doing things the traditional, doing things like, this is the sort of person that you need to be and have courage and integrity and do the right thing and all that. That wasn't, the 80s was...
That went out in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, it was going out. So by the time...
When you got to the 80s...
It was the 80s was all artsy-fartsy, basically, right?
But it was really, I think, the '80s was also the rise of media stars,
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
both athletic and
Yeah.
pop culture, and they in the '70s and '60s there was some of that, right? You get the Beatles, and you get that sort of generation. But in the '80s, for me, I really felt like I've been talking about these influences. I really felt like through the '80s we lost. When was the last time we had a general who was a president?
Right.
Prior to that,
Yeah.
it was pretty common.
Pretty common.
Coming up through the '80s, that was starting to change, and then we were seeing less and less conversation about those types of people, and more conversations about rock stars, and probably in the '70s and '80s where that term was phrased, right?
Yeah.
And athletic stars, you think about the rise of Jordan, you think about Bird and
Yeah.
Magic.
So much more emphasis on ego and personal accomplishment. And then there was, when I think back to that time, it wasn't cool. The traditional role models weren't cool. It was much more about being sensitive and being like, if you were a guy, it was all about, remember, like getting in touch with your feminine side. That was like very popular, like being sensitive, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with any of those things, right? And there were different things for girls, but the '80s was not a time where you had a frame of mind, if you were a young person, where you had a frame of mind that said, where there was somebody who was a role model who was like, this is how we live and this is what we do. And I know that there's an extreme where people do ridiculous things because that's how it's always been done and things like that. But we lost that. I think one thing, as I just reflect back on this now, and I think about what would help younger people now, is I think what we lost was at least some sort of a tether to role models who represented certain qualities, characteristics that, even though as a young person I can't process all this, I can't understand it, no amount of kitchen table conversations are going to help me but in some cases, there's a role model there, whether it's a specific person in my life or whether it's just some sort of stereotype that says, like, I want to be like that.
Yeah, so
right?
It's like you're around the dinner table and your kid really likes this particular celebrity, whoever that happens to be. What are the virtues that person exemplifies that you actually find valuable?
Right. Yeah.
What about Lil Wayne?
I don't know who that is.
You're out of touch, man.
I know who that is.
I had to ask the same cisgender question when we got the review, by the way, just so you know. but anyway, I think that's something that as I think back on this whole problem of raising kids in the modern world, I think one thing that I think about that was lost somewhere prior to when I was a teenager was this kind of old-fashioned notion of role models, and you don't have to understand it. This is just how we live. And I'm not making a judgment on which particular role model is the right one. I'm just saying we lost the concept of that, I think, to some degree. And our role models became, like you said, the celebrities and people who weren't necessarily who.
Well, I think right or wrong in that time frame, you started to see a change in media and in the movies, and so I don't necessarily know that prior to that, what we thought of as role models or who we stood up as role models were actually very good role models necessarily, but the way they were portrayed in media. Right.
So I think looking at famous people as role models is not the right idea, even though I use the John Wayne analogy. But it's more like
that character,
the people in your life, right? Yeah. Like my dad, my mom, my uncle, somebody, right? The guy next door. Like that, like the village role models, not the celebrity.
So we got somewhat untethered from that basic set of values,
right,
that were exemplified by the role models of that time, previous to the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Yeah.
How much do you believe we're trying to reshape a set of those principles at this stage in our country?
Well, that's probably, that might be true.
Yeah. Well, I'm not exactly sure that it is true. Are we getting further and further afield?
Well, no. I think what we're moving toward is more of everything is subjective to the individual. I think this, right?
So if that's the case, then there is no foundational set of principles, back to Trevor's point, that are objectively orienting us as a society.
Yeah, that's probably true.
I don't know if that's necessarily bad, and I don't know if it's necessarily true either. From this standpoint, that role models, as we think of them traditionally, also have a role from media or from society or wherever. As those traditional role models break down, what we're seeing is more and more characters, if you don't want to call them role models, from all sorts of walks of life, from all sorts of backgrounds in society. I think that's a good thing. I think the notion that what you see on TV, what you see, that you can aspire to do that, right? That you see yourself moving forward. So some of these traditional role models that we think of, particularly as older white gentlemen
of a certain age,
that will necessarily change as different influences come into our society. Not necessarily bad, just different, just from the standpoint of I can see myself in this role, and this character, this role model, this whatever, behaves slightly different than what I would think of as, say, John Wayne. Right? Mm-hmm. The way they go about making their decisions, the way they may go about moving forward might be different than what we've seen traditionally from John Wayne. I don't think that's bad.
No.
It's different.
I'm just saying that there very well may be, if indeed it's true, that everyone is starting to become their own set of rules.
Right.
This is the way I believe, right?
It goes back to the other conversation, right? As that happens, now more and more, that conversation around the dinner table, that more and more of you make your decision, here's who are you, right, in light of all this stuff, because there isn't, you can't point to John Wayne as a society and say, that's
yeah. And I guess my point about in the John Wayne analogy is not necessarily that the algorithm in his head was the right one, but the fact that he had one.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas, and it was sort of like universal. Not universal among people, but universal in terms of everything he encountered in life, his characters, right? Well, actually, if you read about him as a person, he's pretty much the same way in real life. Everything that he encountered, with the exception of, like, he did have a problem getting pushed around by females, but that was kind of his weakness, was women had their way with him. But everything else in life, whatever he encountered, there was already sort of a set of, this is how I handle this. This is what, right. and that was driven by certain principles and frames of mind that he had. So let's just call that the algorithm for short, that he had that algorithm, or that other people, and we can think about, certain people, I think, that grew up where that was their dad, right? Or that was their mom, or that was their uncle, or that was the guy, right? So that, having that formula in your head that says, this is what I do, this is how I live, is probably more important than trying to understand and have an opinion and think through all the different things that are happening, and right, like spending a lot of time. Well, you need to understand that some people think this way because they have that, like all of that, it like becomes noise if you just have like this is how I live, right?
So going back to the parenting question, in my family, that was my wife's father. So she would tell our kids all the time, think about how Papa would do this, right? Think about how he would handle this. He's, quiet, deliberate, and she would fall back.
Right, good examples,
all
right?
the time.
Right.
I think that would be one of the things that I'd perhaps do differently now in that conversation around the table, is say, who is it that is out there doing something and saying something that really orients back to things that you feel intuitively are right about whatever this topic is.
Yeah.
What's your role model for this particular
Yeah.
scenario, and perhaps talk through why that person is a role model, or why that person represents the way they feel about that topic.
Yeah, and I think if you look back and you think back on the people in your life that you knew that, whether it was whoever's your dad or grandfather or whatever, they didn't typically get all caught up in the details of any particular topic or situation.
Right.
Right? They didn't really they didn't get lost in all of the complexities of whatever was happening. They just sort of like cut to the, like, they just had a way of like, and like you said, like quiet, deliberate, whatever the right characteristics are, but they had a way of like cutting through like all of the noise and all of the emotion and all of the, well, I'm not sure how I feel about that and what's really right. And well, like they just had a way of like dropping down to, well, no, this is what you do because this is the right thing.
How much of that is oversimplification?
I don't know. Like, is it, it's certainly made things better for them.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I mean, maybe it did and maybe it didn't. If they drew a definitive line on some particular topic, that could feasibly have some knock-on effects that were not really good for them at the end of the day. I don't have a case in point. But,
right. I see. Yeah.
It's going to be black and white for these 15 things. And whatever topic comes across their desk, they're going to say, okay, it fits on number 7 of my 15 points, and this is black and this is white on that particular point. That takes all of these very, very truly complex scenarios that we face and dismisses any of that complexity pretty much out of hand.
True. However, you could argue, is there value in the complexity?
But
I think you could argue either point.
Either go either way.
Right.
But I think the point you're trying to make, and I think actually the point you're both trying to make, is this notion of a role model, right, is really about, if you go back to the parenting, if you go back to the child who's suffering, right, go back to the article, how do you help them make a decision to move forward? How do you help them rationalize their fears?
Or even on a daily basis, move
Start
from
to understand
one
them
thing to the
and
next.
move forward.
Yeah.
And if that process is, I'm going to ask 3 people for their opinions and then make a choice, or if that process is, I'm bulldozing ahead, it doesn't really matter, right? What matters is that they have a template to help them navigate a lot of complexities,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And a lot of uncertainties. We live in a world where we're making decisions without all the information.
The uncertainty is an important point.
Right.
I hadn't really, we talked about complexity.
But a framework
to
through
do
which
that.
they filter things and process that, which probably has a lot to do with those values, those principles, and just the ability to filter in the noise, filter out a path forward.
Right.
Right.
Our framework may have been the kitchen table. Their framework, depending on your social dynamic, depending on what's going on in the home, their template, their framework may be.
It could be the village.
I go to my
sports
neighbor
team.
and say something. I go to my coach and I say something, or whatever. I don't know, right? To that, I think it is a very personal thing. I think you have to, particularly as a parent, you have to help your child sort out how to help them navigate a very complex world. And to your point, it's a world that is much more complex in my mind than the world I grew up in, and more complex than the world my children grew up
I think so. I
agree.
I think it is. I try to like account for bias, like the thing that you're used to always seems less complex than the new thing, but I think it is.
You just think about all the things that we are able to do now and experience now compared to what we could have done and experienced 20 years ago. It really is night and day. So I would argue that it is much more complex.
Yeah.
Is a very simple example, 2 very simple examples. Consider everyone now has a camera, right? At every event, at every happening you've gone.
Right.
And the ability to post that
A
worldwide.
4K digital camera.
In a
now.
moment.
Right.
Right. Without any consideration at all. right? So that alone, that little bit alone, completely changes the dynamic, certainly from when I was little, but even from when my children were young, even the first time they had cell phones, much less smartphones much later.
Yeah.
So that simple dynamic completely changes, in my mind, the complexity of the world that these children are growing up in.
Yeah.
Social media is another one.
That's a big deal. I can think of plenty of examples of times that I'm in my youth that I'm glad that there was nobody there with a
Right
camera.
on. So it's not so much about raising kids. It's more about I'm glad that didn't exist when I was growing up.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. The internet is forever. All right. Are we done, Trev? Is this a good wrap up point?
Not my show.
Anything? I think we're good. How long? The timer. What happened to the timer?
What?
How long? It's been sitting at 39 minutes
39 for a while.
For a while. I think we've been going about an hour and a half.
Oh, my goodness.
That seems like enough, right?
Jeez.
Yeah, that's good.
Nobody could possibly want to hear any more from us.
We ironed that out for
after
sure.
an hour and a half. So, all right, that's good.
But there is
I
a sequel.
I think there could be a sequel. We might have to split this into two pieces, but good stuff though. I think it's good stuff.
Multi-part breakdown of John Wayne.
Yes.
Yeah,
Hey, have you gone to the John Wayne Museum in Fort Worth?
I have not.
worth it.
I really would like to. I am a big fan.
When we were up in Fort Worth.
Yeah. Okay, we might have to do that. All right, that's it. Thanks, guys, for making time.
Yeah,
coming in.
thanks for having
Sorry I
us.
never got up and got your refill, but we
No,
go
it's
do
all
that. We
good.
go do that now.
Right.
All right.